Yeah, so that's a microphone. Hi, I'm Lindsey Catlett. Thank you for coming to this session. We are going to be talking about platforms and multi-sites. I'll talk about the difference between those two as opposed to like single websites. And I'm going to be going through different architecture concepts, development concepts, and just really some of the things that I've learned, in some cases the hard way, as far as building out platforms. And just to give you some background on my experience, I currently work at Aqua. I've been here for about 5 years. I recently moved over to our product team to, I work on one of our platform products now. But I have about 10 years of experience in Drupal, and I've built all sorts of platforms, large and small. And so I hope to share my experience with you guys. And so I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions at the end, because I've learned with some of this stuff, there's often I don't leave enough time, so I will make sure to do that. This should not be animated, but it is. Just as far as the topics that I'm going to go over, so I'm going to distinguish between platform and multi-site builds, as well as single-site builds, like I mentioned, why I'm talking about platforms and won't shut up about them, and why platform projects are often so hard. And so I'd be interested to hear some of your experiences, if you've built platforms before and it's gone well, I'd like to hear that as well. I'm going to go over some common architecture patterns, and I'm going to focus on Drupal 8 for obvious reasons, and then just the key differences between a platform project and single site as far as just planning and architecture. And I'm not going to try to get too technical as far as like code level type things, but I will talk about like deployments, things like continuous integration at a high level. And so just to get started, so some of you may know, building a platform is very, very different than building a single site. You find that when you're building a single site, it's often easy, and you might not even realize that you're doing it, to maybe cut corners. It might be easy to just start development and figure things out later. That is not the case when you're building a platform project. This is something that it can result in just a lot of unneeded pain. I'm going to talk through like how to hopefully prevent some of that. But when we're talking about platforms, and like I'll use platform and multi-site a bit interchangeably. You have to remember that it's more than just the technology. It is the processes of the people around the technology that are often the more complex part. And when you dismiss that, it can make the project very painful. And it often can't be solved with technology. But it's on top of that, there are some technical complexities that are just very, very different than building a single site. You have to be very disciplined in things like configuration management and deployment, and you have to really know your requirements in advance. And when you cut corners with things like that, because maybe you don't know the requirements, or they're not clear yet, or maybe you didn't feel like writing an automated deployment script, when you attempt to scale those things, that's when the platform projects get really painful. So that's what I'm actually going to focus on. It's those things that seem small at the time that you may be used to, SSHing into your Aqua server and doing a features revert all. Like that might work once on a platform, but it's not going to scale because people don't scale very well, and we all make mistakes. Some of these topics that are just really painful from my experience, and I'm trying to be so negative, but I'm trying to prevent your pain. But so some of these things that I've seen that I've personally experienced that can be really, really painful on platform projects, it can be unclear requirements. As a technologist or an architect, it can be so frustrating to want to start building something and you don't have your business requirements yet, and you feel like people can't make up their minds. It can be tempting to just jump in and start developing, but as some of you may know, that can be a very, very risky thing to do. It can result in technical debt, rework. You could be making assumptions because you don't necessarily understand like the business goals that you're working towards. So like I mentioned earlier, these platform projects, and I will go into exactly what that means in a moment, you're dealing with more than just the Drupal site itself. So these projects, they tend to involve multiple groups. They tend to aim to like transform business. They often will attempt to transform business processes. Like for example, content editing and approval, it may be an offline process. Part of this whole platforming may be to pull that online. it can be so you're working with all sorts of different stakeholders, and one of the most difficult things that, at least that I've seen, is getting that alignment across all of those different groups that may have different goals. The third thing is it can be very difficult. So one of the primary goals of a replatforming initiative, it can often be to want to be able to launch websites faster. Maybe this was a pain point at your company. Maybe you want to make template-like sites, and you want to be able to launch them in 4 weeks, where right now it's a 4-month process. So a goal is often to improve your time to value of your technology initiative, whether it's a website or a group of websites. Something that we see is it can be frustrating for leadership and for key stakeholders to understand the value of what they're getting from a platform until they see a website that's launched online. And so I'll go through some of these base layer type concepts that I'm mentioning right now. There's a lot that goes into the scaffolding and kind of just baseline of a platform that is not necessarily visible to non-technical stakeholders, and it can be difficult for them to understand, why you're having to spend four sprints on, your configuration management architecture, automated deploys, and so I'll go through some strategies on how to wrangle that. Since these replatforming initiatives, they often, you are working with a lot of different groups. You could also be working with a lot of different technologies, and something that we've seen is that integrations can be particularly painful if you don't have the proper planning. This can be an integration. It could be content migration. It could be an integration with a legacy system. It could be any number of things. You could be integrating people with people, I suppose. And then fourthly, it's one of the things that is, I think, still kind of a work in progress in the Drupal 8 community in particular, is there's not a lot of development tooling and processes that really have, defined best practices, and some of these concepts and some of these features that you're developing, they're business critical features that you're having to deliver at scale. It's very important to be able to test those things and to be able to develop with them locally and that sort of thing. The Drupal community right now is we're pretty good at doing that for a single site, and we're not good at doing it for multi-site. So if some of you are familiar with Aqua BLT, for example, this is something that we've tried to work on solving, and it's still not done yet, but it's a work in progress, but it is still critically important to resolve these sorts of things. So I'll go through some recommendations. And then sixthly, I suppose, one of the things that we see on these projects is that documentation and training it can seem to kind of be deprioritized, especially if maybe you're running up against a deadline, or you've passed a deadline. But what that does is it's kind of a disservice to the users who are supposed to be using the system. And when they don't have documentation, or they don't know how to file a ticket or something like that, it's diminishing that value, and perhaps time to value, as the third item says. But it's important to remember your users. And so the main thing about this slide is that I wanted to point out, only one of these challenges is technical. And that, I think, it took me a while to learn that the challenges in building a platform, it's actually much easier on the tech side, because a lot of times you can control the tech side, but it's all of these different unknowns that you have to account for in the technology, whether it's not having documentation, or not having time to write documentation, or having to clarify requirements. We can find ourselves as architects and technologists to have to step outside what we may consider a traditional developer or technical architect role, and the people who can do that and be that sort of technologist, those are the people who are very, very good at building platforms, because they realize that the hard part is actually the people and not the tech. It's not to dismiss the tech at all, but if you've done some of these projects, you actually look forward to the tech, because it can be very interesting to have to deal with so many different opinions and so many different, it can be integrations or anything like that. So I guess I will go into some more architecture concepts. So when I say platform as opposed to site, what I mean is, I'm speaking in Drupal 8 terms, and it's, for those of you who heard the term multi-site, I do mean multi-site when I say platform, but I want to differentiate between the two, because multi-site, it implies that each site can be custom, and that each site may have it has the ability to have a unique set of features. There may be some that are shared, but it really is just, it may be like an accelerator to building a single site a little bit faster. So when I say platform, what I mean is a layered, I don't want to say platform yet, so like a layer of cake, where we have our base layer, and I'll bring up a chart in a moment, where all of that functionality, and so this is going to be Drupal core, all of that is available to all of your sites. It's intended to be that way, but it's not just that. So that's where multi-site typically stops. So we have what's called installation profiles or distributions, if you're familiar with that term, on top of that. And so you may have heard of Aqua, Lightning, or Thunder, or any number of things. That's your second layer. Then that's really where some of these projects start to get much more complex, because before you even start adding contrib modules on, we're going to, you typically, if you're familiar with the concept of sub-profiles, you start to build on top of that. And just to walk you through a bit more detail of what exactly I mean here. So for these layers, that base distribution, so this can be Drupal core. It's often a contrib distribution. So this is typically, I'm using Lightning as an example here just because I'm very familiar with it. This allows you to share code. This is typically your global integrations. That could be search. It's typically your base theme. It's just anything that's shared widely across your platform. Then that component, that is then broken down into your actual sites. And so when I say that, you'll hear me say the term inheritance, it's implying that you're inheriting from that base or parent distribution downwards. And so this is the simplest model. This is just using one profile. And so I have a few sites down here. And these are the individual multi-sites. They're inheriting that parent functionality. So there's things that are critical that can't vary per site on most projects. Things like the installation profile. But there are also things that must vary per site. The most common one is site name. So that adds different layers of complexity into your project, even for something as simple as site names. So that's where something that you didn't even think twice about in a single site architecture, you're all of a sudden having to think about, for example, how to manage 8 different site names across a platform. And if something like your site name changed, that could be a very serious thing for most projects, and it could impact SEO, it could impact integrations, any number of things. Turn your webhooks off. That happened to me this morning. But it's imperative to remember just even these things that just seem so simple that we may have dismissed before. It just adds so many different layers of things to think about, not just in the planning process, but as you're building out your architecture, but then also as you're adding on new features. And so it's constantly a process of evaluating what needs to be the same across sites, what needs to be different, what needs to vary for an individual site. And so what happens here is that it can be, I mentioned that sometimes business stakeholders it can be a bit difficult for them to see the value of some of this work, because it may take longer to come to some of these technical decisions. And this is just the simplest model. Wait until a minute. Well, I'll scare you. But when you explain things like how it's, if you're familiar with the term governance, how it's enabling them to enforce security updates, or how it's allowing them to enforce branding standards or content standards, that is where you actually can use technology as your friend to make those things much easier. And so then if you throw different themes on top of that, that's an additional layer. And so this model right here, this is called basic inheritance model. And I totally made up these terms. They're not official at all. But so it's this it looks a little bit familiar. This is that baseline distribution. So this right here, this type of architecture, it is going to be the most common architecture, at least that I've seen in my career, for D8. And it's not to say that'll be the case, indefinitely, but right now, most of our larger builds, they are having this sort of basic inheritance type thing. And so one of the things that Drupal 8 did, and it's not in the core yet, but it possibly will be soonish, is so something that was kind of a deficiency in Drupal 7 was they didn't have this concept of profile inheritance, and when there were some patches to core and some things that you could kind of work around, but it didn't work very well because there are other things that impact kind of managing that sort of inheritance or that relationship, like things in D8 or D7 that like configuration management that just had a lot of challenges, and so it was actually very, very difficult to even to deliver a very basic platform like that's architected like this. And so one of the things that D8, at least a lot of developers in D8 like really tried to push for is they're adding this type of inheritance to core. And when you add, when you are innately able to layer this sort of functionality on top of one another, and not just layer it, but you can actually enable and disable different chunks of functionality in D8. What that does is if you combine that with like the configuration management and other automation initiatives, it pretty much allows that platform to be infinitely scalable at n tiers. And so like you end up with models like this where you have that base distribution and that can inherit from two parents. And so like this may be like a bit extreme for most organizations, but like if you think about these sub-profiles here, they could be different departments or academic groups, and but like they often mimic the organizational structure of your organization, so maybe your org chart. But this type of model, it was pretty much impossible to do in Drupal 7, but the flexibility that is in Drupal 8, for a variety of reasons, it's pretty much limitless with how you can organize these sites and how you can organize their bundles of configuration and their themes and that sort of thing. And so what happens though is you have to be very, very, very diligent because there is so much flexibility. You have to be very diligent about your planning and your execution. And so as far as architecting these actual profiles, so something that you'll see, and just like whether you're a project manager or a developer or an architect, this is just an example. This is called a feature matrix. And so to come up with a model when we're talking about these different layers of functionality, you have to kind of take a step back and think about what all these sites have in common. And that might be just a very common sense type thing for a lot of you, but at least from what I've seen, to even fill out a feature matrix such as this one where there's just 7 sites and 8 different features, a lot of organizations for the first time, they're having to do these things. And then they often don't even realize some of the ways in which maybe they were having communication problems or where there was just redundant efforts. And so even an exercise as simple as this, at least when I've gone through like discovery and planning and architecture with different groups, this is where you start to definitely understand the organization a bit more. But this is where the people component can start to be a bit more difficult to manage, and because it tends to be that groups will logically organize into these different site groups almost, and it's quite interesting. But it's not your job to necessarily push them into that group or anything. But what I've found is that it's trying to figure out not that technical reason why they want this platform, but their motivations and goals behind organizing that way. And that is actually what really informs not just like the individual features, but like your prioritization of them. So like for example, I have site 1 on here. This site 1 has 7 different or 10 different features that are pretty common to every website or platform. Press releases and social media and content moderation and search. And who's what's it that I put there. So that site needs every single component. And then like this might be an obvious exercise to many of you. It's very helpful to identify where there's overlap. in this matrix. And what this is doing, if you kind of turn it on its side, it's informing what that base layer needs to be, because it's what is shared by most sites. And so, like, the things that you should ask yourself, and as a developer or architect or tech lead, when you're building out these profiles, you may have to ask yourself a few questions that you may not quite be used to if you're building a single site. And so it's things like, what global configuration is valid across this band or this layer of sites? And so, like, what maybe not only is it valid, but like, where may configuration need to differ across sites or environments? And so this could be something like, do you need a different search index in test? Or if you're using a product like Aqua Content Hub or something like that, you probably don't want to lose your production content. Like, those are things that I think can be a bit difficult to wrangle, because if you're kind of stuck in this single site mentality, it can be easy to kind of slip and make some of, like, I've definitely made many mistakes where, like, I didn't think about, like, if I didn't turn off Google Analytics, or if I didn't make my search index read-only, like, not just for the environment, but for the individual site, just the impact that it could possibly have, not just on migration, but in some cases that could be pretty serious or detrimental. And it's not to be negative, but it's just like, the weight of each decision, even if it seems minutia, it's something that you have to evaluate each step of the way. And with that, though, there's ways to prevent all this, all these nightmares that I've been warning you about now, whether it's search or losing content or something like that. And the way that you do that is, like, testing is so important. And because you're dealing with things at scale, you're going to be more efficient if you automate that. And I always recommend, like, end-to-end automation, I say. But if you think about that, like, not only do you have to automate from end to end the creation of a new site, maybe from your local to launching it in production, if you're dealing with multiple sites here, not every technical decision that you have to make, you not only have to think about creating that new site, but you have to think about updating the sites that are already there. And that is probably the single most complicated thing to think about, because that can be very counterintuitive if you're used to this single site kind of mentality. But there's ways that I will touch on to resolve that conflict. So I'd mentioned that we touch on deployment, and this might seem like I'm jumping the gun on some of the stuff with just how to deploy your distribution or profile to production. But it's actually intentional in that you have to think about things like configuration management and deployment and automation and testing like much earlier when you're managing a platform project than you do a single site. Like, so for me, it can often seem like an afterthought to do BHAT tests or to finally write your first PHP unit test. And that's fine for some projects, I'm sure. But if you've ever had to work on a multi-site or a large platform project, if those things are an afterthought, it kind of has diminishing returns, because you may be having to do manual deployments, and every time you add a site, it's adding 2 hours onto your manual checklist, and then you introduce human error into that. But if you don't have regression tests, like, you then usually start to do things like, maybe database swaps or other things that make you not sleep at night. So, but it's, this can mean, like, if you're emphasizing these sorts of things from the onset of your project, it can mean that you have a bit of delay in your first launch or, your first live site. And that can be a bit like counterintuitive. But there are like many benefits to doing this. And it's not just to keep yourself sane at night, but to perhaps protect the integrity of your site or your data. So one of the key things here, a common development workflow that I see in a single site is to just push, like, if you're on Aqua Cloud, you just push your code directly to production or directly to a branch. That may be fine. However, what we've what I've seen with some of these large multi-site projects, as much as you can prevent that code being merged in to, I say, your live environment, even if there's multiple stages of that environment, like dev, test, and live, like you want to catch as much as you can before it ever enters that environment. The best way to do that, in addition to automating all of the things, is to this is, if for those of you who are familiar with the concept of continuous integration, is to have what we call a build deploy process. But what that means is this can be a very different development workflow than you might be used to. So this often involves having a second repo, I often say canonical repo, that has kind of the guts of your project. That is not production code. That should be considered development code. And that's kind of where most of your development happens, and that happens outside of your hosting environment. But since code is never being pushed, it can kind of be a bit intuitive. And so what you're doing here is dealing with what we call a build artifact. And the reason why you're doing that is because the stuff that you need on a platform project and the development process, so all of your testing stuff, if you're using a virtual machine, it could be your VM config, it could be your front end, if you need certain libraries or testing frameworks in development. Like that typically is very, very different than your pristine production artifact. So like in production, you need things like Drupal core. You need things like your installation profile and your contrib modules. Those two things are kind of at odds with each other. And so like, the Drupal community right now in particular, they've come a very, very long way in how to get from A to B here, because this was not an easy thing in D7. It required a lot of custom code. Very few vendors worked nicely together. But if you ever worked with like things like Travis CI or other services, like, it's definitely much nicer because what we've seen is, as much as you can adopt those frameworks and leverage the community-based, whether it's a continuous integration solution or like a testing library, it's really facilitating these really complicated builds, and it's much more flexible with what you can deliver, because D7 was a bit limiting because you're having to spend all of your time on the technical side of setting up, your BHAT tests and, continuous integration and all of that. And to have that just, be done at the beginning of your project, and to know that you're pushing quality code, or you're merging quality code rather, and that it's not even being merged by a human. It's like, it's a bot or whatever. That, I think, it actually enables you to think about the quality of your code. If you're doing code reviews, like you can actually spend your quality time on not just identifying like syntactical errors, but really looking at the quality of the code, because it might sound like overkill to say, but you have to remember, like, every single line of code that you deploy on a platform like this, like, not only does it have to consider updating a site and then creating a site from scratch, but it needs, since there is so much flexibility in D8 now, and presumably beyond, these platforms they're intended to be almost infinitely scalable, and like that's a big burden to take on. And so, as much as you can remove all of these different things that you can control, like testing and continuous integration, like that is where you're going to get your most value, and that's going to be for the business side and for the technical side. Let's see how much time I have. So I was going to go into some additional recommendations and just like common mistakes that I've seen, but like I want to make sure that I leave time for just Q&A. So are there any questions or topics that anyone has any burning questions about? I always run out of time when I'm doing these, and so I wanted to leave adequate time. No? I'm going to call on Jacob. Oh, no, I'm kidding. Hi.
Hey, can you repeat the questions? And my first question is, are you participating in the BLT project now?
I'm one of the maintainers, yeah.
I realized how I connected your name, and I realize now why.
Yeah. Well, so BLT is, I might have a graphic of that. I try not to like not sell. I try not to
Yeah.
advertise my own projects that I maintain. So BLT is set in sort of build and launch tool. It's Aqua is not our CLI tool, but it bundles up. It automates a lot of things that like we built it as a group when I was in professional services at Aqua. Jacob has contributed. He also works at Aqua. We found that we were kind of recreating the wheel on every project, and there's certain things that you just need to do on every project. We needed to set up automated tests. We needed to make sure that we had the drush commands that checked for security updates that they would run before we did a deployment. And like for us to recreate the wheel on every project, we were not doing things the same way, even internally, for a group of like 12 people, which was crazy. 2, we all had different strengths and talent. I'm particularly fascinated by continuous integration. It might sound really weird, but people have different strengths and weaknesses. I'm the first to tell you, I am not very good at figuring out front-end builds. But so we kind of came together as a subject matter experts to define what the Aqua standard would be, and I think the enterprise Drupal standard for how to do some of this stuff. And a big part of that that I've focused on is the MultiSite component, because there's things that are just so, at least they were so difficult that are just no-brainers on a single site. Things like drush aliases and synchronizing databases across environments, and the concept of having to create a site locally and develop for it, maybe manage configuration for it before it actually exists. That is actually a very, very difficult problem to solve. So that has kind of been our collective initiative, just at scale, not just for multi-site, for enterprise Drupal. And it's been one of our more successful open source initiatives, but if you guys haven't checked it out, I definitely encourage it. We definitely take PRs, but there's lots of cool stuff in it with your front-end builds. We're starting to integrate other Aqua products and other partner products. It's just I think it's a very good framework that at least can provide you an example of how this stuff is done at scale. Because I can tell you, even if you don't use something like BLT, you're going to have to do that work anyway, and you do not want to have to write those scripts. It's kind of terrible. And so we want you to use our work and contribute to it. But do you have any specific questions about the roadmap or anything?
No, just thank you for contributing to that.
Yeah. I just don't like people asking me questions, and I'm just kidding. No, but it's something that I had to learn the hard way in some cases, and so we're all just trying to contribute.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how Composer helps with that build artifact piece?
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. I did not mention Composer in all of this. So for those of you who are more familiar with D8 and just PHP development in general, so D8 uses Composer as its package manager. If you use Drush a lot in D7, it's not the replacement for Drush, but it's doing a lot of the stuff that we use Drush for rather in D7 when it comes to downloading contrib modules and updating Drupal core and any sort of package dependencies. Because if you think about it, if you look at probably some of your GitHub repos right now, if you're using Drush for all that, they're probably really huge. You may run into a situation where maybe a developer was using Drush to download it, but then they still changed the code. There's just no reason to have that much overhead in your repository. And that can be for performance reasons, it can be for security reasons, if anyone ever still actually hacks core or contrib. But it also, if you're having to deal, so something that happens when you're dealing with massive code bases is you may have custom patches, you may have contrib patches. We all know some modules are better maintained than others, and it may take, or they may be there may be a patch that's very debated, the installation profile inheritance one, for example, that are just very, very critical to bundle all of those things into what I call the build artifact in the correct way. And it's not just so that you can have a deployable production artifact, it's so that you can bundle that up in any environment. So whether it's locally, or if you're using something like Travis, you can bundle up, it's basically a production build on a different environment. And so the complications that we have had in different instances with not being able to test certain code and staging or something like that. Like many of those complications rather are very much removed, and it rapidly facilitates things like automated testing and patching is a big one. And I mean, I think it's some may disagree, but I think it's the right way that packages should be managed, because that's in core, because that's how the PHP community in general manages it. It's not through Drush. Drush is great, but it should not be used for configuration or dependency management. So, yeah. Cool.
Does anything further in your presentation touch on how to manage configuration, configuration splits, configuration?
So that's something that I've also worked a lot on, like features. So there's kind of three schools of thought with configuration management, and two of them are more common than others. So in Drupal 7, we had something called features, and Drupal 7 was not that great at separating data from configuration all the time, and so we had Mike Potter came up with what he called the features module, and what that did was it allowed the exporting. Kind of almost, it was intended to only be configuration, but in D7 sometimes it had to be a bit of data and schema into these reusable bundles. And so that was it was pretty much the only way to deploy configuration in D7. That could be very, very, very painful. It is not the way that Drupal 7 works. It's not the way that Drupal 8 works innately. And so things like deployments could be just very painful, because you would have circular dependencies. And if you're familiar with the concept of feature reverts, it was just not, it worked for some, but it was just not very scalable. And so a lot of people acknowledge this, that it was not scalable, and it was just making it very painful to do a lot of these things. And so in core, in Drupal 8 core, one of the primary goals was to improve this. And so they had what they call their configuration management initiative. And so that was kind of the first pillar in development in this whole configuration management thing in D8. But some of us quickly realized that that actually wasn't enough, because we were doing things like building platforms. So we very quickly realized that pretty much every single entity or thing that you could change on a site, it needed to be able to be independently exported and managed independent of the site and the environment. And there's a few different ways to do that, and some of them are still a work in progress, but I think the community's headed in the right direction. A module called config split was then contribbed. And what that module does is it allows you to export that bundle of configuration. It can be per site. I think it was originally intended to only be environment, but people quickly realized that that wasn't even enough. But that concept and that ability to abstract configuration away from some of the confines of D7 has been very, very powerful, because that whole thing with I mentioned creating a site in your local environment and then deploying configuration from your local to production without it actually existing yet. That's how you solve that problem, if you can abstract the actual environment in the site from that equation. But yeah, so there's other things the Thunder distribution is, they have something called Update Manager, which you should, if you're managing a distribution, you should definitely look at, because it's built on a lot of this, but it takes it to another level, and it does things makes you a production checklist, because something that we're wrangling with right now is on really, really big platforms, or depending on your requirements, it's maybe you want to roll out some updates and make them optional for a subset of sites. That is a very, very complex problem, because you need to, if you want some updates to be rolled out, but then some to be optional, and then some things that can be optionally overridable. That's a real word. It's in some project plans, or a real phrase. It can make you go crazy with these feature matrices and things like that. But there's solutions out there now, and I think things are kind of headed in the right direction. But any other questions? Or? Tough crowd. Cool. Well, yeah. If there's no other questions, I won't keep you guys any longer. But I'm happy if anyone wants to stop by and chat. I will hang around. But thank you for coming, and good luck platforming.